And that is exactly what the ad is refusing to acknowledge. It refuses to acknowledge the political moment in which it exists. And that silence is doing the most work in the entire commercial because we're in a period of openly televised genocide that is backed by the Western states, that is being carried out by Israel. So let's talk about this ridiculous anti-Semitism awareness commercial that aired during the Super Bowl. The one that was staged entirely inside a generic school hallway, where a few seconds of interpersonal cruelty were presented as a complete moral universe. The thing that makes this ad so absurd is not just that it's bad or shallow. It's that it tries to place itself in the same moral register as struggles like anti-black racism while stripping away every single thing that makes those struggles real and material. The comparison collapses the moment you look at it for more than 5 seconds. The ad is not even attempting to be explanatory. It doesn't even really try to clearly define anti-Semitism beyond what is demonstrated. It doesn't ask where anti-Semitism comes from, how it operates, or how it is materially enforced, which is what defines actual racism. And it that point alone that separates these kinds of shallow accusations of racism or quote unquote hatred from any serious discussion of systemic anti-black, anti-brown, or anti-indigenous racism, etc., which cannot be explained without talking about things beyond the schoolyard, things like policing, incarceration, housing, labor, health outcomes, surveillance, wealth extraction, state violence, etc. Anti-black racism is not just a bad vibe. It's not just a bad atmosphere. It is a living, breathing, material structure that is actively killing people every single day. It impoverishes communities. It determines who is protected by the law and who is disposable to it. This ad has no interest in anything like that because it isn't doing any type of material analysis. It's doing perception management. It's managing a social situation. It's managing public opinion. It's managing social anxiety. It's managing public perception. And once you recognize that function, everything about how it's constructed snaps into focus immediately because the primary way that it manages perception is by shrinking the world until nothing material can fit inside of it. And that's why the setting of this commercial very much matters because everything takes place in a school hallway. And that is absolutely not an accident. But the logic only works because none of the structures being applied actually exist in this commercial's universe. Anti-black racism in schools is materially enforced. It operates through discipline policies, surveillance, policing, tracking, suspension, expulsion, and direct pipelines into incarceration. Those structures are real, they're material, they're measurable, they are very well documented. There is no comparable institutional system that exists that is targeting Jewish students. If anything, Jewish students are more likely to be protected by school administrations than be criminalized by them because there is no structural apparatus to point to. The commercial can only gesture abstractly towards bullying, with interpersonal cruelty, the stand-in for actual material systemic harm. And that abstraction is then falsely elevated into the same category as anti-black racism, which is just absurd. The school hallway is not chosen because it lacks power, but because it allows power to fizzle away and disappear. And by shrinking the problem to essentially just vibes and manners, this commercial just avoids confronting the fact that the comparison it's making completely collapses the moment that reality is allowed back into the frame. So what we get instead is essentially, again, bad vibes. That's all it is. Someone is mean, someone else feels bad, and that's essentially it. That's the entire universe that this commercial allows you to see. And that is what gets presented as anti-Semitism, not something rooted in political ideology or state power or historical violence, propaganda, or material conditions. It's just interpersonal cruelty, a comment, a bad look, a feeling. Anti-Semitism becomes a personal moral failure rather than a social political phenomenon. and it gets detached from reality and turned into this into etiquette and moral. And this is where the comparison to anti-black racism just becomes, it's not just wrong, but it's utterly obscene. Anti-black racism is not primarily about hurt feelings in school hallways. It involves that, but it's not primarily that. It is about armed agents of the state coming to your school to kidnap you and your loved ones. It is about who gets stopped, searched, caged, beaten, evicted, poisoned, or killed. It is about material outcomes that can be measured in years of life lost, wealth stolen, and bodies destroyed. You cannot stage anti-black racism as a vibes-based problem because it's the material violence is unavoidable. The system insists on it being seen. And this ad, by contrast, depends purely on it being one-sided and invisible. Someone said something bad to them, so it must be the same as actual systemic anti-black racism. Someone else feels bad because of something that someone else said, it must be the same as being racist towards black people. End of story. Once you frame it like that, the argument is already over, because if the problem lives entirely at a level of individual behavior, then the solution does too, right? No systems need to be examined, no institutions need to be interrogated, no state narratives need to be questioned, no foreign policy needs to be mentioned, no propaganda ecosystem needs to be looked into or analyzed. And most importantly, there is no reason to ask why this issue is being foregrounded now in this moment of all times. The world disappears, and all that's left here is manners and morals. And then they hit you with that statistic, right? 2 in 3 Jewish teens have experienced anti-Semitism. It sounds definitive. It sounds empirical. It sounds like science, right? Like 9 out of 10 dentists agree. But in reality, it holds really no statistical weight in any way. There's no definition of what counts as anti-Semitism. There's no breakdown of severity. There's no distinction between qualitatively different experiences. Everything is just collapsed into a single category and treated as equally urgent as systemic racism. But these things are not at all the same, and pretending that they are obscures how actual racism functions. Because a great example, like when a black student is called a slur at school, that act is backed by an entire system. It exists within an institution that already disciplines black students more harshly. It surveils them more closely. It routes them more disappropriately into punishment, exclusion, and criminalization. An insult like that is not isolated, it is reinforced by material power. On the contrary, while bullying a Jewish student is obviously harmful and wrong, it is not supported by a comparable institutional structure in any way. There's no systemic apparatus in American schools that targets Jewish students for heightened surveillance, punishment, or disposability. The harm remains interpersonal rather than structurally enforced. And collapsing these experiences into the same statistical category does not clarify it to be racism. It erases the difference between prejudice that is socially backed and racism that is materially enforced. The result is a moral flattening that treats all harm as equivalent, even when the structures behind it are radically unequal. And everything gets collapsed into the single category of false equivalence and presented and treated as equal. And that type of vagueness is not a flaw. It's the entire point of this type of propaganda. Because once a term like that, anti-Semitism, racism, can mean anything, it can be used against everything, right? Like the number doesn't clarify reality. It disciplines the audience. It tells you not to ask a follow-up question. If you want to ask what counts or what decides or why the category keeps expanding, you suddenly become suspect. And that is fundamentally different from how claims about anti-black racism functions, right? Because when people talk about anti-black racism, they are pointing to material patterns that can be observed whether or not you agree with the politics, right? Police budgets, prison populations, mortality rates, redlining maps, environmental exposure. These claims invite scrutiny because they're anchored in real world material things, right? And this ad does literally the exact opposite. It demands difference without any type of evidence. And the commercial isn't there to inform you, it's there to basically shut you up. And this is how moral authority replaces any type of explanation, not just through advertising, but through sports, through media, and through statecraft. You're not supposed to understand what's happening. You're supposed to feel anxious and compliant. You're supposed to feel like something terrible is happening everywhere, but without being able to be given any of the tools to understand why or who is responsible. And then you're given this solution. Post the symbol, post the square. That's the centerpiece. That's the action. You're good now. You've done your part. You didn't challenge any institution. You didn't threaten any policy. You didn't interrupt anything material. You didn't confront power. You just signaled. And that's the politics that are being offered here. Politics being reduced to a brand, a symbol that absorbs anger without creating any actual leverage. It costs nothing, it risks nothing, it changes nothing, but it gives people the feeling of participation, which is very much the crucial part, right? Because it could be attached to your identity. Because of that anger, we're actually turned into material analysis or higher education toward to advance the intelligentsia of the public, organizing or resistance to these things, it would land somewhere very inconvenient. It would land you against Israel. And that is exactly what the ad is refusing to acknowledge. It refuses to acknowledge the political moment in which it exists. And that silence is doing the most work in the entire commercial, because we're in a period of openly televised genocide that is backed by the Western states, that is being carried out by Israel. There is global outrage. There is massive protest across the world. And that anger is not being directed at vibes, right? Is being directed at institutions, at states, at militaries, at alliances, at systems of power. Rather than address that reality, this ad pretends that none of those things exist. There are no states, there are no militaries committing mass atrocity, no geopolitical alliance, no imperial backing, just a poor Jewish kid in a hallway, just abstract moral theater floating out in the abstract air. And in that abstract space, it's these accusations of anti-Semitism that are deployed without any clear justification. In any real context, accusations like that would need to be grounded, defined, and argued, or else they would minimize the accusation in itself. But here, they don't. They function as a emotional framework that is designed to criminalize dissent. And it's not by banning it outright, right? It's by making the terrain so unstable that people police themselves, and if anti-Semitism could mean being critical of Israel, being critical of the state, being critical of capitalism even, then any criticism becomes risky by default. And that's how dissent gets managed, through this ambiguity, through suspicion and fear of social punishment. And again, the most egregious move that this ad makes is refusing to acknowledge the social context and the political moment in which it exists. Because when you present all claims of anti-Semitism as this individualized, interpersonal, hateful incident, detached from any type of broader context, there is no recognition that many contemporary accusations of anti-Semitism are not responses to personal hatred at all, but to political opposition to an Israeli state that is currently being accused of committing genocide. And that opposition is being reframed through public lobbying and messaging, just like this commercial, as if it's actual bigotry, when to suggest that is just absolutely absurd. And the bigotry of a people is about dehumanization and, what Israel does to Palestinians on a daily basis. Opposition to such a thing is about power. It's about policy. It's about state violence. Treating these as interchangeable allows the crimes in which they're committing to be hidden behind identity, while recasting political dissent as a moral failure of the one that is opposing these crimes. And the ad's messaging is ultimately perverse. Anti-Black racism remains systemic and materially enforced. This version of anti-Semitism that is being presented here is just reduced to vibes and feelings, and really, in the end, ordinary Jewish people are being turned into a symbolic stand-in for Israel's state policy. And anyone who attempts to name the material realities of that is accused of not just being wrong, but being immoral in a way that, the accusation of it could affect their life. And at its core, this ad is not about any type of public safety. It's about stability of public opinion. And it functions as perception management, not any type of material analysis. And it individualizes harm and depoliticizes the current social and political moment, and it redirects outrage away from institutions and towards moralism and etiquette. And it looks like, care about public safety. It looks like, solidarity towards the Jewish community. But what it actually produces is a carefully engineered absence, one that prevents scrutiny, interrupts public dissent, and keeps power comfortably out of frame. And the omission of the moment, it's not accidental. It is the work that this ad was ultimately designed to do.